is the case with most Bible passages, it's important to understand the context of what we read, especially when a reading begins with the phrase, "on the same occasion." An opening like that prompts us to ask what happened on that same occasion. What happened that led to the exchange between Jesus and some people in the crowd and ended in a short parable about a barren fig tree? See, this is just the lectionary passage for today, so we're prompted to go back a few verses. And if we go back these few verses before where our reading begins, where the lectionary has us begin, we find Jesus scolding a crowd of people for failing to interpret the present time. It almost sounds like Jesus is taunting them. This is what Jesus says. You know that a cloud in the west means it's going to rain, and you know that a wind from the south means that it's going to be hot. You can read these signs, so why can you not interpret the present time? Now, I don't know about you, but this seems a bit oversimplified and a pretty unfair comparison. I don't know how knowing whether or not it's going to rain is comparable to knowing how to successfully navigate the complicated political regimes, economic systems, social expectations, and religious obligations of the present time. It's not as easy as knowing whether or not to wear snowshoes or sandals, because living in all its multifaceted and multidimensional angles is hard. So it's on this occasion, this critique of Jesus, that someone in the crowd raises their hand and begins the exchange that our scripture reading picks up this morning. And I like to think some brave soul in the crowd was trying to make sense of the present time, and finding it difficult, decided to push back a little bit on Jesus' critique, saying, "Do you want to know why we struggle to make sense of the world? Do you really want to know, Jesus? Here, I will give you an example." And this is where our reading picks up. This brave soul from the crowd says that just the other day, a group of Galileans were offering up their sacrifices in the temple. In the holiest place, they were there minding their own business. They weren't hurting anyone. They were fulfilling the law. They were being faithful, and yet, in the midst of their faithful service, they were gunned down. They were killed, and their blood mixed with the blood of their sacrifice. This is what Pilate did. This is our present time, Jesus. So you tell us, how are we to interpret this present time? This isn't about a rain cloud rising in the west or a scorching heat coming up from the south. This is about the senselessness of suffering and the presence of evil in our world, in every time, not just our present one. So you tell us, Jesus. You tell us how to interpret the times and to make sense of this tragedy. Sound familiar? Whoever brought this horrific event to Jesus' attention was raising one of the biggest issues and the hardest questions that have made interpreting the present time so much harder than interpreting the weather. How are we to make sense of the presence of evil and suffering in our world? It's one of the most confounding questions of our time, not just this present moment. It's a question that theologians and philosophers have wrestled with for ages. It's a question that we know deep in our bones, in the center of our soul. It's one that we have struggled with at one point or another. How do we square the presence of evil in the world in light of God's love and goodness and seemingly omnipotence? Most of the commentaries on this passage included some reference to Job and how Job's friends tried to make sense of his suffering. You must have done something wrong, they keep telling him. You must have made God angry about something to have deserved this. Job's friends keep trying to find a cause for the suffering. They want to point their finger at something because that's how we want the world to work. We want goodness to be rewarded with goodness, and we want evil to get what it deserves. This is how we want the world to work, because if it did, then it would be easy to safeguard against bad things happening to you, right? If you just did what was right, good things would come to you, and you could avoid suffering. This isn't how the world works. This isn't how God works. So in response to this situation, Jesus flips the script. Instead of engaging in a theological discussion about the nature of evil, Jesus ends up telling a story about a tree. He begins by saying how the Galileans who were killed weren't any better or worse than anyone else. He makes this very clear. And he continues by saying that the same goes for the 18 people who were killed when a certain tower collapsed. These weren't evil people, these were normal people. And by emphasizing how those who died weren't the greatest sinners in Galilee, Jesus shuts down any debate about whether or not they deserved to die. Instead, he turned the crowd's attention to something else. The most important question isn't whether or not they deserved what happened, or if they could have done something to avoid what happened. The most important question, Jesus says, is how we are to respond in the face of such evil. In the face of suffering, what are we to do? Twice in this short little passage, Jesus repeats the warning that you'll come to the same end unless you change your ways. Jesus emphasizes that a change is needed. But then this raises the question of what and how are we to change? And to answer that, Jesus tells this short little parable with no real resolution and no explanation to unpack it for us. This is the story. A fig tree was growing in a vineyard, and one day the owner came looking for some figs. And finding none, the owner went off on the gardener. For 3 years I have come looking for figs, and for 3 years I haven't found a single solitary one. So cut it down. Cut the tree down so we can use the ground for something else. But the gardener asks for more time. Let me tend it for 1 more year. I will pay particular attention to it, and if after a year it hasn't borne any fruit, then we can cut it down. The end. Thanks, Jesus. You answered all of my questions. I don't know about you, but I want to know what happened next. Did the gardener follow through on what he promised to do to the tree? Did it work? How did the tree respond? Did that owner ever get his figs? We don't know. And wanting to know takes us back to that same old problem. I want to know if the characters get what they deserve. But Jesus invites his listeners. Jesus invites us to check that response. And instead to linger for a minute in the possibilities of this parable. Now, by definition, a parable welcomes us to come in and to explore, especially in the ones where we're not given an explicit explanation like this one. We're invited to keep turning the parable around, to keep looking at it from different angles to find new and ever deeper meaning. Now, I had this toy as a kid. It's a pretty simple toy, and many of you probably have seen some version of this. It's 3 blocks stacked on top of each other. And the top block has 4 different heads on it. The middle block has 4 different torsos on it. And the bottom block has 4 different kinds of legs and feet. Does this sound familiar? Anyone? So imagine these 4 blocks with different faces on it, and you can turn it to make these different figures. I was a very simple child, and I was easily amused. But this is the image that I think of when I think about how we read a parable. How we are invited to make meaning out of this story that Jesus tells. Turning the story, viewing it from several different angles, helps us discover what the story has to teach us, making different figures out of it. So in this parable that Jesus tells, in response to those wondering how they're to interpret the present time and make sense of tragedy, we find 3 figures, right? What are the 3 figures? First we have, anyone awake out there? First we have the gardener. Okay, what else do we have? There's a tree, and then there's a, very good, A+. So we have a tree, we have in order of appearance, we have the tree, we have the owner, and then we have the gardener. And each one of these has their own perspective, each one has their own need, each one has their own lesson to teach us, and each one has changes that they need to make. Because remember, Jesus tells this parable after warning the crowd that they need to change. So, let's see what we can learn from the tree, the owner, and the gardener. 3-point sermon, A+ for me. All right. First, the tree. The lesson of the tree is to bear fruit. And while it is okay, we learn that it is okay to take time to focus on personal growth for a season. In the end, we are called to bear fruit. Consider all of the resources, all of the water and the nutrients that this tree has used up over its lifetime. I didn't look into it, but I assume it takes a lot of energy to grow a tree. A lot has been poured into this one little tree, and it's time to change. It's time for it to change from taking everything for itself and to start giving back. It needs to start bearing fruit and feeding others. The lesson of the tree for us is don't just take up space. Use everything that God has blessed you with to bear fruit and to feed others. Now, I wish I had more time to go into all the amazing things that fig trees can do. Believe you me, I went down a rabbit hole learning about fig trees this week. And if you want to hear stories, feel free to come up to me after service and I can tell you all about how cool fig trees are. But for now, it suffices to say that they are really cool. Take my word for it. So, with this turn of the parable, we're invited to live into the fullness and the coolness and the awesomeness of being a fruit-bearing fig tree. Lesson of the tree. Next, we have the owner. Now, a quick Google search that started me down this rabbit hole of fig trees told me that it takes 2 to 6 years for a fig tree to mature and to start bearing fruit. Now, granted, the owner didn't have the power of Google at his fingertips, but he could have done a little research. He could have asked someone who knew a little more about fig trees, right? I mean, the gardener was right there. Maybe the owner should have just asked, "Hey, when can I expect some figs?" But instead, the owner was quick to react and made a hasty decision. Without a second thought, he saw no figs, so he said, "Chop it down and plant something else. This tree is no good to me." He didn't ask questions. He didn't take the time to fully understand the situation. He didn't process the long-term effects of his quick decision, of his immediate desire. He just wanted the tree chopped down and something else planted in its place. Now, we're not told what he wanted planted in the tree's place, but I assume, since he wanted figs so badly, he probably would have planted another fig tree, which would have left him worse off, since, as I said before, it takes 2 to 6 years to get figs from a tree. So, instead of reacting so quickly and making a short-sighted decision, the owner would have done well to check his volatile reaction and to take a minute to seek more information. The lesson of the owner is the danger of quick judgment, of jumping to conclusions. So with this turn of the parable, we're invited to ask more questions, to seek knowledge, that we might respond with wisdom and thoughtfulness rather than haste and ignorance. Lesson of the owner. Finally, we come to the gardener. This person who is not afraid to speak out against the owner's hasty decision and to advocate for the tree. "Give it 1 more year," she says, knowing that the odds are good it will start producing fruit by year 4. It's pretty good odds if you know the life cycle of a fig tree. But the gardener goes beyond just making the case for the natural maturation process of a fig tree. Knowing how much the owner wants some figs, the gardener promises to take special care of the tree over the next year, to hoe around its trunk and to give it special fertilizer. Recognizing its need as well as its value, the gardener is willing to change how she has been caring for the tree. So with this particular turn of the parable, we see that cultivating life is hard work. The gardener shows us that sometimes we need to get a little dirty, to work a little harder, to pay a little bit more attention to those who are struggling to flourish. We see this all the time. We see this in teachers and in coaches, those who go above and beyond to care, to reach out and take care of the students that need just a little bit more attention. I'm sure many of you can think of someone who saw your potential and invested special attention in you. This is the lesson of the gardener. The gardener shows us the joy that it is to participate in the growth and blossoming and flourishing of others. These lessons, these 3 lessons of the tree and the owner and the gardener, deepen our Lenten focus on laying ourselves bare before the cross. As we continue on this journey, it's my hope and my prayer that we're taking the time and doing the work of clearing away those things that keep us from living and entering into the fullness of Christ's love for us. 2 weeks ago, we named our temptations. Last week, we examined our loyalties. And this morning, Jesus' parable prompts us to lay bare our needs, both what we need from God as well as what God needs from us. By turning the parable in the different directions, we discover what it means to change our ways in the face of evil. By considering the variety of lessons it has to teach us, Jesus' parable invites you, invites me, to recognize our own needs. Is it to bear fruit? Is it to feed others? Is it to ask questions? Is it to cultivate life? As we continue journeying to the cross, may God give you the courage to lay bare your need and the strength to keep moving the things that block you from living into the fullness of life that God desires for you. Amen.